Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we posed the question, why don't atheists and agnostics take seriously the positive evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Another way of asking this is, why do so many of them automatically dismiss it without even giving it due consideration? I identified two main reasons, although over time we'll be discussing even more. The first of the two main reasons is that many atheists and agnostics are under the impression that a prerequisite to belief in the resurrection of Jesus is belief in God. So, since they don't meet the prerequisite, they won't be able to believe in Jesus' resurrection regardless of what evidence might exist. Christians respond to this in different ways. Some Christians agree that belief in God is a prerequisite for belief in Jesus' resurrection, since if God doesn't exist, or if we don't know whether God exists, then how in the world could a person ever conclude that Jesus rose from the dead? These Christians would affirm the prerequisite of belief in God, and they are sometimes cautious of other Christians who disagree. Their advice to atheists and agnostics would be to first explore the evidence for God's existence apart from the resurrection of Jesus, and if they still do not arrive at belief in God, then just imagine what it would be like to believe in God while exploring the question of Jesus' resurrection. My goal here is not to quarrel with other Christians. In a real sense, we're on the same team, so as apologists, we need to be careful not to get distracted too much with internal debates. I actually think that pointing non-Christians to prior reasons for God's existence can be a great thing, and if it helps them and leads them to belief in God, then this might very well help them when considering the resurrection of Jesus. But as Christians, we have to remember that there are many atheists and agnostics who have already explored other reasons for God's existence, and find them to be insufficient. So it is sometimes redundant and unhelpful to tell them to first explore other reasons. To play the atheist advocate for a moment, consider that even if one already believes God exists, one has to then decide whether God would do something like raise someone from the dead. How does one decide this? There might be many deists, for example, who think the best way to understand what God would do is to understand what he already does. In this case, they would look at the general uniformity and universality of non-resurrection as overwhelming evidence that even though God exists, he would not and did not raise Jesus from the dead. And you'll notice this is a form of the probabilistic argument against resurrection. The only difference is you can make the very same argument with a prior belief in God as you can without a belief in God altogether. I'm not going to go into more detail about that right now, but I mention it simply to demonstrate that the helpfulness of a prior belief in God is not necessarily as straightforward as some of us Christians might think. One would have to analyze the topic in much more detail, which can lead to all kinds of nuanced conclusions, which is why I jokingly said in a previous video that making belief in God a prerequisite requires the atheist and agnostic to become a natural theologian like Richard Swinburne. We have to realize that most people are not in a position to navigate the rigors of natural theology beforehand, and at the end of the day, it can end up looking like wild speculation based on hyper-rationalism and over-reliance on reason, rather than based on experience, credible sources, and more reliable evidence. Reason is great, but it has limits, and it needs to be directed in responsible ways. So, can a prior belief in God be helpful when considering the resurrection of Jesus? For some people, and in some situations, sure. However, is it a necessary prerequisite? No, it's not. So my goal here is not so much to convince other Christians that their approach is wrong, as it is to give a different perspective to those atheists and agnostics who don't have a prior belief in God. So let's get into it. As I see it, a prior belief in God's existence is not necessary for belief in the resurrection. Let's look at the reasons. Number one, there are other possible explanations. While there is no good evidence for this, it is nonetheless a logical possibility that another natural civilization from another planet visited Earth with advanced regenerative medical technology and raised Jesus from the dead. Another naturalistic possibility is an anomalous genetic mutation that kicks regenerative processes into high gear after death, bringing Jesus back to life. When Christians hear me say that, they understandably cringe. They think, see? This is why you shouldn't study philosophy. I understand where they're coming from. However, consider that the usefulness of my point lies in the fact that it demonstrates to the naturalist that they have one less reason to dismiss the resurrection from the start. They don't have to start with a deistic or theistic worldview in order to believe in resurrection. Discovery is a step-by-step process, one step at a time. The first step is to take the subject seriously, which the naturalists can rationally do. Number two, even if there weren't any conceivable naturalistic alternatives, A natural phenomenon can be observed and acknowledged without first knowing and understanding the cause. In other words, the question about causation can be left for later discovery. And indeed, acknowledging the occurrence of phenomena in the world is the most effective way to set out on an investigation to discover new causes. So, one initial possibility for the naturalist to consider toward the beginning is that perhaps the event was preternatural. That is, perhaps it was natural, but we just don't understand it yet. And we have to all admit that there are likely countless things we don't yet understand and know about the world. We simply don't have to draw a conclusion about the cause at the very beginning of our investigation. So there you have it. A prior belief in God or the supernatural is not necessary for investigating and believing in the resurrection of Jesus. It is at least logically possible for his resurrection to fit within a naturalistic worldview. So for any of you atheists and agnostics or historians watching this, I hope this helps you to open your mind and heart a bit so that you can give yourself rational permission to take the question of his resurrection seriously, at least at the start. Now, if you later conclude that it didn't happen, and he didn't rise from the dead, then at least you can have peace of mind knowing you didn't mistakenly rule it out from the beginning. If he did indeed rise from the dead, the specific cause and the nature of that cause can be a later question. This also has implications for whether we start out by defining Jesus' resurrection as a miracle. In my opinion, that should be a conclusion rather than a presumption. But let me ask you a question. If taking Jesus' resurrection seriously as a legitimate topic of historical investigation were to eventually draw you away from naturalism, would you feel willing and free to take that step? Do you know what's better than naturalism or any ism? Truth and reality. Truth and reality are better. That should be our goal, discovering truth and discovering reality. There's a lot more to say about this subject, but I'm going to stop there for now. In the next video, we're going to look at a second thing that often leads atheists and agnostics to automatically dismiss the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and that is the overwhelming uniformity of our experience, as per David Hume, as per Bart Ehrman. So stay tuned. If you like the content of this channel, and if it gives you something to think about, then please like, subscribe, and share with others you know. See you in the next video.